same joke I make every week. Howdy everyone, welcome to Regional Faith. We're so glad you're here. A couple of announcements. One, this is our last formal official meeting of the semester.
Ooh.
I thought for sure that y'all were about to cheer, and I was about to be like, stop cheering, but then everyone booed, and I'm like, huh? Anyway, last meeting of the semester, very sad. Thank you. So, this Saturday at 5:30 is going to be at my apartment.
To be in my apartment.
I live in it longer than you do. 'Cause I leave the 19th. But so at my apartment, there's going to be a debate night where we're going to have dinner served, and we're also going to watch the debate between Bart Ehrman and Justin Bass that recently happened. Very cool. Highly, highly recommend you go. The address and time will be put into the Discord, so if you're not already in the Discord, what are you doing? Get into it, like ASAP. And it's going to be at 5:30 at, the address is 2800 Waterview Parkway at number 5732.
I think you just doxed us today,
The government knows way more about me than anyone else. Anyway.
One viewer probably.
Alex Paul. I'm kidding. Okay, right. So Saturday we have that.
Is there gonna be food there?
At the Saturday thing?
Yeah.
Dinner will be provided.
Cool.
So there will be food, aka invite everyone. Right?
So be there at what time?
5:30. 5:30 this Saturday, my apartment. Right? And also sets and Ralph, but whatever. I only live with them. And then next Thursday is not going to be an actual meeting. It'll be a
end of year party.
end of year party. So there will be pizza there, and there will be games. I hear there's going to be Jeopardy Part 2
And milkshakes.
and milkshakes and pizza, and it's going to be so much fun. Definitely come to that. Definitely bring your friends.
Maybe some ducks like us.
Is it here?
It's going to be here. It's going to be here.
We're gonna do a duck fight again?
No,
We should. We should have Dodge Duck.
Josh Jones probably won't be here to supplement y'all's addiction. So, okay. In other news, yeah, that's like it for the semester. A couple of things. One, I don't know if you know this, but like half the leaders in Reasonable Faith are graduating this year, including me. So,
Yeah, he's finally gone.
I've only been here for 6 years.
Cheers.
Only been here for 6 years, right? Anyway,
What did that mean?
nothing. But we are on short supply of manpower for leaders. So if you want to be a Reasonable Faith officer,
What about woman power?
huh?
What about woman power?
We're really short on that.
Short on that.
We can Sarah.
Make that joke on the internet live stream.
Greta's allowed to make it because she's a woman.
Fine, but like, but for real, if you wanted to like be an officer in Reasonable Faith, talk to me or Alan or Seth or any of the other leaders here, and we could definitely hook you up for like summer gigs and like fall gigs because like, you know,
We need help.
we need help, and it would be really great if you could do that. So, but yeah, that's. Oh, right. Last thing. So, ICR is a super cool thing. If y'all don't know what it is, that's the Institute for Creation Research, and it's basically just like a giant museum for like help me out here, Alan. It's like creation kind of research and development and kind of showing like I think they're younger creationists for the most part. Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so like it's this cool little thing where they show off a ton of like nice arguments for a young Earth, and they're over in downtown Dallas, which is fantastic. It's like a museum. They have a giant dinosaur, which is fantastic, right? And so
Not everything in the museum is oriented around the age question, of which Christians may land at
Are you
different
sure those aren't
places.
just cow bones they put together wrong?
I will. Sorry. That's
So yeah, they have a lot of interesting
Yes.
things.
So we want to go to ICR as like an impromptu kind of official but non-official thing because it'd be after finals week. And so I know plenty of y'all are like not Dallas natives, but I do know that we don't want to have like a field trip during finals week because that would really suck for y'all. So like a couple of the dates so what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna put a bunch of dates in the Discord and like the community hangouts. I'll say, hey, here's where we're going. Here's like the 3 kind of dates and times I imagine, and then how many people would be interested, and then you can kind of vote on which date you would prefer. I'll put that in Discord sometime later tonight.
Me and
Yeah.
I may also have like 3 guest rooms if anybody needs a place to stay with if you have to move out already, but you want to stay.
We'll definitely
Oh,
do it
wow.
before the 13th or sometime. So
Okay.
we were gonna either do it before on the 13th or after the 13th. But that's what we
That's
wanted to vote
every
on.
day.
Huh?
That's every day before, on, or after.
Well, that's literally kind of how I talked about it in the legal meeting. So, but
Good point.
don't worry about it. It'll be fine.
I think it was like the 11th, the 13th, and the 15th.
Yeah,
their prospective
right.
days.
The 13th, most people move out, so it might suck to be like, oh crap, I need to get out of my apartment as fast as physically possible, and then let's go see the dinosaurs. So I'll put it in the Discord, and then you can vote. Obviously, we can't make everyone happy, and we can't go all 3 days. So I'm really sorry if you can't, but this is not really an official RF thing. It's more of just like, hey, a bunch of us want to go see ICR, so feel free to come and hang out and have fun. That's everything I had. Did I forget anything? Cool. And without further ado, I would like to present Mr. Alan Hainline presenting about UK.
Thank you, others. All right, yeah, we'll jump in here. There's a lot that we can talk about. So I was here 2 weeks ago. I think most of you were here, not everyone, but we sort of went over what we called understanding the Old Testament. We looked at issues associated with, like, well, how do you decide how to interpret some of these passages, things like that. And we discussed some historical validation. So we're going to kind of continue and build on that, and especially look tonight at challenges, because there are definitely some challenges, let's be honest. In the Old Testament, there's some hard passages to interpret, or ones that people at least twist to make the Bible look bad, that we need to try to understand what is it really saying. So that's kind of the plan. Yeah, we did talk about things like Job and Ecclesiastes last time. We're going to start off going through just real briefly a couple tidbits on prophecy, because I think that is where there's a really positive case that could be made that these had to be inspired by God. But we'll spend more time on these other things. The Levitical laws, those can often be confusing. Some skeptics like to put a picture of shrimp on a meme or something and say, well, you guys say, you can't eat these things, you don't follow these laws, so why are you condemning homosexuality or something like that? So there's a lot of common talking points that derive from the Old Testament. All right, and we're going to deal with the question that came up at the last Pancakes and Pontification, which I missed, but I understand that it was discussed, the claim that the Old Testament authors were polytheists, or at least some of them, and that later there was some editing to try to hide that. So I've studied a lot over the last few weeks that challenge, and so I can share a few things about that. We'll talk about the issue of slavery. You're reading the Bible and it mentions the word slave. That raises a lot of red flags just right there. We can talk about that. Well, if we have time, we can get into the issue, where it's like there was this command to go and conquer this land, drive the people out. And some of the passages even mention, killing people. What is that all about? So that's the plan for tonight. So let's jump into prophecy. Now, last year we did sort of a record amount of going through prophecy. So this year we really haven't, I don't think, talked about it much, because we try to rotate material through the years. If you stay with Reasonable Faith for 3 or 4 years, you'll usually hear some core topics multiple times, and then other things you'll hear every so often. And yeah, this is one of those in that category. But basically, one of the reasons for thinking the Old Testament might have been inspired by God is the predictions it makes, not just for future events that have already happened, but ones that have to keep on happening over time, which is really kind of wild. When you think about it, they speak of cities that will be destroyed and never be rebuilt. That's something that could easily be falsified in our lifetimes, but hasn't been. Or people could even just read that in the Bible and go try to falsify it. And so that's kind of interesting to think about. So I'm not even going to read everything I show up here, but this is kind of giving you a feel for there's multiple avenues of evidence even just within this one topic. But I'm going to mention the first one briefly on subsequent slides. But yeah, we talked about these over a year ago, year and a half or two, and we'll probably cover it a little bit more next year if you're around. But yeah, Babylon is one of the examples that was predicted to be destroyed, not rebuilt. Stones were to be left in place, not recycled, which is very rare in the ancient world. And yet you can see pictures of the ruins of Babylon and see that that is indeed the case. Brian Bell talked about Tyre in some detail in that time frame I mentioned. But just real briefly, so here's some real short prophecies in Ezekiel about a couple cities in Egypt, Memphis and Thebes. In chapter 30, it says, I will destroy the idols and put an end to images in Memphis, and will execute judgments on Thebes. Thebes shall be breached, and Memphis shall face enemies by day. So it's giving different predictions for these two different cities. And yeah, one of the interesting things is destroying all idols in one of the cities. But it only says that about Memphis, not Thebes. All right, so Memphis did indeed face, this might have been a little bit easier to predict, right? A lot of cities will go through times of warfare. But, in particular, Memphis had some of the bloodiest battles in history. The interesting thing about a lot of the prophecies is you can just go on Wikipedia and easily find, validation in publicly accessible places for, the things that are said in the Bible. But it wrote it, hundreds of years before the events actually happened. So yeah, the interesting thing about Memphis is the Muslims, not known to be ones motivated to fulfill Jewish prophecies, but they came in and destroyed all the idols. They rebuilt their city. Cairo, what is modern day Cairo, was 12 miles away, so they hauled off. They did recycle, in this case, unlike Babylon, a lot of the stones from the idols. But they just tore them down. There's virtually no idols there after this kind of destruction. Whereas Thebes, it was cut off. That's a Hebrew euphemism for killed. There was, definitely some major battles there. And it was breached. Unlike Memphis, Thebes fell to military conquest in the 1st century. But you can go to Thebes and find just a ton of idols. Actually, it's a great place if you're in Egypt and you want to see some interesting ancient artifacts. That's a great place to go because they're still there, unlike in Memphis. Yes, Rob?
Going back to the point about Muslims carting off the stones from Memphis.
Yeah.
Islam is an Abrahamic religion, right? It traces itself back to Abraham at least. Does it not? How does Islam consider what we can call the Old Testament?
I'm not an expert on that, but I think there's a certain level of respect for it. But I think also, I know even when we've had our Muslim friend Sharif here, and we've talked about some of the Old Testament things, he doesn't seem to have the level of respect that we would for it. Do you have details on that, Rick? Or
I think they respect the Pentateuch and Psalms, but not all of the others.
Yeah, there seems to be a difference there.
Books, and then they still say that they may be corrupted, but they don't provide any evidence.
Yeah, so I don't think they have a lot of respect, for example, for Ezekiel, the book in question here in particular.
Well, I think they also basically say that doesn't apply to us because they trace their lineage spiritually through Ishmael, and so they say, well,
Right.
okay, that may have applied to the descendants of Isaac, but not to us.
Yeah. All right. Good question, and thanks for the help there. All right, there's a number of these sort of cities where specific things are said about two cities, nearby or something, and so you can make this kind of allusion to, the famous novel by Dickens, Tale of Two Cities, where, if you switch the names, then they would be totally falsified. So it's true not just of Memphis, Thebes, but also of Tyre and Sidon, where Sidon faced war and disaster, but was not abandoned. But ancient Tyre was completely abandoned, at least the island part of the city. Ashkelon and Ekron, these are ancient Philistine cities. And Ashkelon was reduced to ruins, but as predicted in Zephaniah, it became a Jewish settlement. Whereas Ekron was uprooted and they've had trouble finding it. But some archaeologists think that he dug it up under the sand, which would fit exactly in the prophecy in terms of it just being this sort of hidden thing. Nineveh and Babylon also are a pair of cities of this nature. Nineveh was to be destroyed and left desolate and become a place for grazing sheep. And sure enough, the mound for this largely unexplored ancient Nineveh, literally has the name Mini Sheep. It was destroyed suddenly, location forgotten for centuries, long abandoned, but now the Mosul suburbs have sort of reached the edges of it anyway. But anyway, that's just a real sampling, and we can get into that more next year on prophecy. Yes?
Just a quick question. I'm sure it differs for each one, but is like a common response to this, like, oh, but it must have been written after these things happened. Like, how far after did this type of stuff happen than when the Bible was written?
Yeah, that's obviously a key question, because it's of no value if it wasn't, right, time-wise. So we do, once we had the Dead Sea Scrolls discovered, then that put back the date to, in many cases, like the 2nd century BC, where it's just like absolutely, there really is not good reason for thinking these were written in like 400 even. There's pretty good scholarly consensus that, these various things had to be written. Even the liberal scholars will say, they're not written in like 200 when you first get the Dead Sea Scrolls. You also have the Septuagint being translated before that into Greek. And so, some of these, as I mentioned, like when it says Nineveh and Babylon will be destroyed and never be rebuilt, well, that applies even to the present day, right? So those are clearly, plus when they were destroyed in most of these cases is like well after the Dead Sea Scrolls time frame.
Okay.
But there's a lot to work through to really dig into all the details.
I just wasn't sure if this stuff was in BC stuff or AD stuff happening.
It's a little bit of a mix, but
Gotcha.
But in most of these cases, there's, I would say, a minimum, good scholarly and archaeological evidence for the time frame being right. Some of them they could push back a little bit on. Other ones, there's just like there's no way they could make that argument.
Okay.
Let's jump into the question of laws. So this is something that you don't hear taught a lot in church necessarily, from what I can tell. It gets some attention in some churches, obviously, but you're reading through the Old Testament. A lot of people maybe read through the Bible in a year, and you're reading through Leviticus or something. There's just like all these laws. Some of them, frankly, seem maybe to our modern ears, this seems weird. What do I make of this? How do I apply this? So I think it's useful to think in terms of there being sort of 3 types of laws. There's different ways that scholars approach these, but one common way is to think of them in terms of 3 groupings. One would be the moral laws, which would take things, often it'll say something as like an ordinance or a statute, and they draw a distinction between those two, as you'll see as we get into this. But the moral laws would be including things like the 10 Commandments. It relates to God's nature. These are just moral truths that would be true of all times. And it relates to things like justice. It's designed to promote the welfare of the people who obey them, and especially to keep people from, oppressing other people, things like that. So it encompasses regulations, sexual conduct, respect, justice, things like that. And then another category would be the so-called ceremonial laws, or in Hebrew, the word would be hukum or chukah. I'm probably butchering that pronunciation. I'm not a Hebrew scholar, but this literally would mean the custom of the nation. And so when you see the word statute, then that often is sort of referring to this category. It's not necessarily a universal moral truth, but it's something designed for people to give attention to God, how to get a right standing. So they were commanded to make sacrifices, right, in the Old Testament. But in the New Testament, we're told in multiple places that Jesus is the ultimate sacrifice. He paid for it by paid for our sins by dying on the cross, and therefore there's no longer a need for the Old Testament sacrifices. So when you see the New Testament, at least you could say makes claims that some of the Old Testament was just for a period of time. But interestingly, as we'll see, the Old Testament itself makes that same claim as well. It claims there's a new covenant, things are going to be different in the future. It just doesn't give you all the details until you get to the New Testament. All right, so some of these relate to remembrances of God's work in Israel. Some of these are pretty centric toward the nation of Israel. God chose a nation to reveal himself to with the intent, and we talked about this a little bit a couple weeks ago, that they would be a light to the nations. They would be ones that would make God known to other peoples. It was never meant to be this ethnocentric, oh, these are the special people, everyone else we don't care about. That was not the intent at all. But it was more that if God could reveal himself to a nation and they could be kept pure and holy, they could learn and grow. And ideally, if they followed God, then they could be in a position to be a really good example to others and make God known to others. And just as we as Christians in the modern church era fail, often they failed, but sometimes they had some measure of success at that as well. So yeah, some of these regulations were to protect the Israelites, the Jewish people, from the pagan neighbors. They literally had some of the worst neighbors in the history of the world in terms of like, just some, it would be like if you lived right next to Nazi Germany, in the 30s or 40s.
And the country's name was Poland.
Yes, you would have suffered a lot, right? And there was a lot of bad stuff going on. Like they would take their young kids and give them to their gods. They would put them on a hot plate. They would literally burn them to death as a sacrifice. So how warped is that? I mean, everyone has, you love your kids. It's, something that comes very natural to parents. How warped is it that you could reach that point in a culture, that you would do that to a living child? It was often babies, but sometimes it was even a bit older than that. So that's how warped it was. Also, within these laws are several things that are signs pointing to the coming Messiah. Things like Passover, the redemption of the firstborn, the Sabbath itself. And then the third category of laws would be the judicial or civil laws. And these were very specific to the culture and place of the Israelites. I mean, if you're reading through the Pentateuch, the first 5 books, some of it is just, Moses telling them, here's how we're going to operate our culture in this time period. And, there might be some interesting things we could learn from that, but it's not as though, as modern day Christians, we should think, oh, whatever I read in here, I'm just going to go off and do that same thing. The New Testament is clear, and even as I said, the Old Testament is clear that these were not written for all peoples for all times. So let's look at an example. Leviticus 19, you shall keep my statutes. You shall not let your cattle breed with a different kind. You shall not sow your field with 2 kinds of seed, nor shall you wear a garment of cloth made of 2 kinds of material. Which of the 3 categories do you guys think this is? And why would God have inspired Moses to sort of give this kind of law?
Well, it seems like it would fit more under the ceremonial law, but I think that this kind of law is tending to say is like it's modeling Israel's holiness, the fact that God set them apart from the other nations, and that, like in other places, God commands Israel to like not to intermarry, not to mix with the other nations. And I think this kind of law is meant to be like a symbolic reminder of that sort of thing.
Yeah, excellent. I think you nailed it there, Kevin. Yeah, I mean, as we said before, if you see the word statute, that's probably statute. It's probably a clue that it is in the ceremonial law category, a lot of which is to help Israel be pure before God, have various reminders of what God is calling them to. There's nothing inherently evil about making a garment of 2 kinds of material, right? It was just something God wanted them to do for a time as a reminder. And in fact, there's something interesting we'll get to about that in a minute here, but yeah, the priests were actually told to mix these different kinds of material together in what they wore. So this itself might be a way of saying, don't try to be like the priest if you're not a priest. Yes.
Just to repeat what you just said, you're saying that the priests were allowed to mix fabrics?
Yeah, the ephod. I've got something coming up on that. So yeah, this is more of the custom of the nation category, staying separate, as Kevin alluded to. There really was just two local materials primarily they used in this time period for clothing, wool and linen. But yeah, the ephod of the high priest involved both of these, as can be seen in these passages cited here. So yeah, there was nothing inherently evil about mixing the fabric, but the mixing was simply to be reserved for the high priest, and it may have served as a reminder of God's holiness. So sometimes there's a deeper purpose in these, and it's not like a direct, like, oh, that's evil, how can you do that? You guys right now, we probably all have, clothing that's mixing polyester and cotton and so forth, and there's no reason to think that's a violation of God's moral law.
Sorry, I missed the third category.
I went over that pretty fast, didn't I? Yeah, I don't have a lot there, but it was more the judicial civil law. It was related to things where Moses was just trying to guide the people in having a culture that would thrive, some pragmatic aspects, you could say. So now we can talk briefly about, well, what laws apply today? I would say arguably, and people might have different, it's fine if you don't just, you don't have to agree with everything I'm sharing. I'm just sharing some perspectives that there is a rational way to view these, and I might be a little bit off, but somebody else has it right. There's no challenge that you can't overcome in understanding the Old Testament that would just make it look foolish or immoral or anything like that. There is ways to reconcile some of the confusing passages. That's the main takeaway that I want to leave you with here. But I think a really good model is to look at the New Testament. How do they deal with the Old Testament? What can we learn from their attitude, especially the writers of inspired New Testament material? How do they treat the Old Testament, and what can we learn from that? So, one interesting thing, sometimes I've heard people say, like, you can't just say some of the laws apply and others don't. That's totally arbitrary. But actually, if you look at the New Testament, they really did say some of those do not apply. And it was, by direct divine revelation. For example, in Acts 10, they used to have all these foods that were prohibited from eating. And we're going to get into that as well later. But Peter had these visions, and it took him multiple times. But, he had these visions. And basically God was saying, look, you can eat anything now. We're not under those restrictions anymore. And his response was, by no means, Lord, I've never eaten anything that's common or unclean. The voice came to him a second time, what God has made clean, do not call common. And this happened 3 times. And he finally got the message. And then you have Paul in Romans writing that Christ is the end of the law, so there may be righteousness for everyone who believes. That's not saying there's still not moral principles, but there's a sense in which the law, the totality of the law in the Old Testament, was no longer necessary. Greta.
Maybe this is slightly tangential, but do you think after that, Paul, or
Peter with visions?
Sorry, yeah, went and started eating stuff that he thought was unclean more? Or do you think that was more just to communicate that he should talk with the Gentiles?
That's a good question, but yeah, this was sort of in that part of Acts where he was interacting with Cornelius, is that right? He was supposed to go eat with them, right? And
I think so.
So yeah, I think if you had visions like that, though, I think you probably would expand your diet a bit, right? It's hard to say because it doesn't tell us, right? But at a minimum, it taught him not to preach that to others. And you see in Acts, the Jewish Christians got together and they were debating, what do we tell all these Gentile believers, these non-Jews? And the thought was, we're going to keep it very minimal. Sexual immorality would be emphasized. Don't eat things sacrificed to idols. And that was about it. It was very minimal. So that gives you some insight into...
And there was even debate on the eating the food sacrificed to idols. Right.
You have in
Yeah,
Romans
true.
14, Paul saying, really, it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
But yeah, you don't want to be a stumbling block.
Yeah,
You have a thought,
I was
Brian?
just gonna add that wasn't really a matter of adhering to the law, it was for people's conscience.
Yeah.
Yeah, right.
Not-
Okay, very good. Yeah, the one whose faith was stronger, Paul said, he can eat meat and not worry about it. But, you know, if you're a stumbling block, it's better not to eat meat, is basically what he said in Romans 14. And then specifically with respect to the Sabbath, we're also told, don't judge anyone by what you eat or drink or with regard to religious festival, new moon celebration, or Sabbath day. These are a shadow of the things that were to come. The reality, however, is found in Christ. That's a really seminal passage. And if you read the book of Hebrews, which I read several times in preparing this, I was trying to grapple with, you know, how does it all fit together? Because it really is a beautiful book talking about, you know, the sacrifices and the priesthood and how Christ was the ultimate priest. And it just really helps you understand, I think, the Old Testament, New Testament, how they fit together. And it also speaks about how, you know, these things were pointers to Christ once he's come. You're in this new covenant, as it talks about in Jeremiah.
Next time somebody talks about Santa Claus being bad, I'm gonna point him to that verse. Don't judge anyone by regard to religious
There you go,
festival.
yeah, right? There's a lot of freedom and liberty in Christ, yeah. The law, and see, it uses the same terminology in Hebrews 10 here. The law is only a shadow of the good things that are coming, not the realities themselves. And these sacrifices could never make perfect those who draw near to worship. But when Christ had offered for all time a single sacrifice for sins, he sat down at the right hand of God. For by a single offering, he has perfected for all time those who are being sanctified. That's the beauty of the Christian message. So here is the verse I mentioned from Jeremiah 31. I won't read the whole thing for sake of time, because I've got so much I'm trying to cover, but the key points are that all along in the Old Testament, there's this thought that there's this new covenant coming, there's a Messiah coming, and it's going to be different. And, you know, he says that we've got this covenant with the house of Israel. He put my law with them, I write it on their hearts. I will be their God, they shall be my people. No longer shall each one teach his neighbor and each his brother, saying, know the Lord, for they shall all know me, from the least of them to the greatest, declares the Lord. For I will forgive their iniquity and remember their sin no more. So it's definitely showing that we should expect things to change at some point, right there within the Old Testament. And then Hebrews kind of gives you an insight into, well, how do I interpret that passage we just read? It says, in speaking of a new covenant, he makes the first one obsolete, and what is becoming obsolete and growing old is ready to vanish away. Pretty strong words. I mean, so as Christians, we really are not under that whole corpus of law that you read there. And think of how burdensome it would be, you know. Thank God for Christ to free us from that burden. But it doesn't mean we don't have an obligation. I mean, in the New Testament, it speaks about how, you know, you were supposed to tithe in the Old Testament, but there's almost this thought of like, hey, we're in this age of grace, go beyond, you know, don't limit yourself, have a heart of loving God and others that would just be very generous. So the law, though, it does have a purpose. It's not like this was some random thing that was just, okay, it's obsolete now. You know, Hebrews there could almost make it sound negative, but no, if you read the New Testament, you see that it does speak about the law positively, and you see Jesus himself saying that he came to fulfill the law. By being perfect and being our sacrifice, he could only be our sacrifice if he was perfect. By being perfect, he was able to then have us reach the state where we no longer need those sacrifices. But in Galatians, Paul says the law is a tutor to lead us to Christ. It's a way, in a sense, of showing that we have need for forgiveness. By knowing the law, Paul says that it gave him more conviction of sin. It gave him an understanding that he falls way short of God's standards, and therefore he needs a redeemer. He needs a sacrifice. And it was hard for him because he grew up in this very, you know, blinded Jewish mindset in the first century. But after he had this vision of Christ on the road to Damascus, he came to understand eventually that, hey, we're in this new era, and that this law that showed us our need for Christ is ultimately just a pointer to Jesus himself. And I think I mentioned 2 weeks ago how it's interesting that Moses, he wasn't able to go to the promised land because he hit the rock. He saw it from a distance, but Moses is usually equated in the Old Testament with the law, right? He gave him the law, 10 Commandments. So the law gets you to the promised land, but only Joshua, the Greek name for Jesus, gets you into the promised land. It's kind of a neat picture because the Greek word Joshua, it really is the same as Jesus. It's just like Hebrew, Greek kind of differences. So literally, Jesus gets you to the promised land. Jesus will get you to heaven. The law will not. The law will show you. It can get you to the doorstep and show you your need, but you better follow Jesus into the promised land. So yeah, Yeshua. There's a few notes on that.
There's even the idea of like the Jordan crossing the Jordan River kind of being like a baptism almost.
Yeah, there's a lot of things that are sort of pictures there in the Old Testament. Alex.
So when you say that Jesus shows up in the Greek New Testament, right?
Yeah.
Does Jesus show up in the Septuagint for Joshua?
My understanding is, so Yeshua is the Hebrew name. English calls it Joshua. But yeah, it's essentially, Jesus is sort of an anglicized version. I think it's essentially the same name. If you look in the KJV on these couple of verses, Jesus, it actually translates it in Hebrews when it's referring to the Old Testament character of Joshua as Jesus, which is kind of interesting.
I have Yesoi in Joshua 1, just from what I've seen.
Yesoi. That's which.
All right, moving on here to an interesting thing that I saw in a debate. We're going to have this debate watching party Saturday, which will be cool. But there was a well-known debate in which Sean Carroll, cosmologist, atheist, was debating William Lane Craig, and there were several others on each side. But he made an interesting complaint to Craig. He said, you would expect the sacred text under theism, if there's really a God, you'd expect these holy books to tell us interesting information like the germ theory of disease, or tell us to wash our hands before we have dinner. So what's the problem with that? Apparently he didn't realize, he had not read, even though he claims to sort of be a former choir boy and former Christian, that actually Leviticus has a lot of very good details of this type, including washing your hands with running water and things like that. Even things like, burying human waste. Lots of very pragmatic, sanitization-oriented things that actually did prevent disease in the culture, and that were well ahead of what others knew during that time period. So that itself could be said like, hey, this does look like it's some evidence for divine inspiration. There's a lot in there about the sick being quarantined. It uses the terminology of unclean. It doesn't mean morally unclean. It means literally, like you've got germs or something you need to separate. So a woman, after they have a baby or something, they didn't go to a hospital and be able to wash them up in this perfect way. There literally was a need to sort of, have the germs go away for a while before they would go to church, even, which may sound harsh, but go to the temple. There was a very pragmatic thing. Yeah.
So the Septuagint does say Jesus for Joshua.
Okay, cool. Yeah, that's what I would have expected, but good to confirm.
In the Orthodox Church, they actually still do. When my sister-in-law had a baby, she could stay home from the church tradition for a month or something.
Okay.
Yeah.
See, that's where I would see like, oh, we're in this modern era where we have different hygiene. That was for that time, but
I mean, as a
that's fine.
Mother of a new infant, she was fine with it.
Yeah, actually, yeah, no pressure to go back anytime soon, right? Yeah. All right, yeah, there's a lot about quarantining sick of various kinds. They talk about hyssop, which is known to have actual antibiotic properties. Now, I mean, they couldn't get penicillin or something, but they had to make use of what they had, right? So, I mean, what do you expect? It's not going to be a treatise on the germ theory of disease in ways that they couldn't have understood in the Old Testament, but it is going to be a pragmatic guide that would keep them, as healthy as you could expect in that time period.
Should have taught them quantum.
What's that?
Should have taught them quantum.
Yes, exactly. Sean Carroll literally complains that it doesn't have like modern physics details in the Bible. That
Should have
yes.
taught them about loft wave functions and tight and semiconductor bad structures.
Yeah. What would the point be, right? They wouldn't have understood. It wouldn't have done them any good. And
It totally have taught them that.
Maybe they
Yeah.
maybe got different feeling and they're like, what is this garbage? Throw it
Actually,
away.
all we know, right? Plus, okay, what if he showed them information that someone could make an A-bomb out of? Can you imagine like Genghis Khan with nuclear weapons? It's really a bad idea. I don't think you want too much knowledge there.
The immortal Mongolian.
Maybe that's what maybe God revealed that during the Jericho.
That was the 11th.
And
The 11th commandment was regarding
then the
Manhattan
instructions were
Project.
lost because they were destroyed along with Jericho.
No, that's what happened to Sodom, okay?
All right, so
Anyway.
getting back on topic, those are good comments though. What did the ancient world know about these things? So if you look at various experts writing about what is known about the time, for example, they say the idea of contagion was foreign to the classic medical tradition. Hippocrates is thought to be, sort of the founder of modern medicine, the famous Greek. But he certainly didn't write about, the aspects of, hey, these diseases are contagious, we need to quarantine people. It really was specific to, in ancient writings, to only, the sort of Levitical law, what you find in the Pentateuch and so forth. Now, science did eventually catch up, obviously, and you could say go beyond it. There's more details than God would have had reason to reveal. But it's interesting how long it took, right? Because in the 1840s, you still had doctors that were doing autopsies, and then without washing their hands, they're like, okay, now we're going to go deliver these babies over here. So the infant mortality rate was terrible until they realized, hey guys, you need to sort of wash up in between these two different medical activities. It seems so commonsensical to us today, right? But it just shows you how much we take for granted once you know something. But they didn't know that at, 4,000 or 3,500 years ago or whatever, when the Leviticus was written. So it's pretty phenomenal that they have all these details. Yeah.
Okay, so does Dr. Magoo, so he says that the kind of level of like quarantining was not found in things like the Hippocratic Oath, but does he know whether or not, and you can comment on this too, does he know whether or not there are examples of things like quarantining in other societies kind of at that time? Because I would imagine for something like leprosy, you would have, it didn't take the New Testament.
It didn't take a rocket scientist to be afraid, like,
of lepers, right? For example. So, what do you think of the argument saying that the New Testament copied these kinds of practices?
You mean
from
the Old
their neighbors?
Testament, really?
Right. Yeah.
Because they come in the early part of the Old Testament.
Right.
I don't think there's really evidence that it copied it from anywhere. But, from what I've been able to tell, these writings are so ancient. There's just not much that is that ancient to begin with.
Do we know if
a lot of the really ancient Mesopotamian writings are just talking about stuff like, how do you dissect, how do you use these livers to discern the will of the gods in the future? All this crazy stuff. You don't find contagion. At least according to the references I'm seeing, this is not my area of primary expertise or anything.
I've heard before that the ancient Egyptians were using moldy bread to treat wounds.
Okay, yeah, there's definitely a lot of bad examples. There's bound to be a few cultures that kind of had some level of
basic medical care.
But for sure, it was nothing as sophisticated as Leviticus. And I can't think of any writing. I haven't seen anybody reference any writings. Even looking at what skeptics are saying about stuff, they haven't been able to produce like, oh, go look at this. They copied, you just don't have that out there that I could see anyway. But it's a good question. It's worthy of more research, I would say. Okay, yeah, there's a whole bunch of things. I'm going to fly through these just kind of give you some summaries. But so they're told not to eat things with like fins and scales and things like that. There are a number of dangerous things of that category that contain toxins, blowfish, shellfish. I mean, even today, right, you hear periodically, oh, the oysters, you know, these bottom feeders in the bays of Texas and other places, they'll get toxin buildup and they'll have to just shut them down. But you have to have some pretty sophisticated monitoring systems to know when that happens and when it doesn't. Or here's an article, you know, in India, they have these contaminated shrimp, microbial contamination. But there's no way you could test for that in the time. It was better, the safe thing to do at the time of Leviticus was just ban anything like that, shellfish, etc. Yeah.
So why would God allow it if it still probably was bad to eat in Jesus' time?
Well, I would say that, I mean, I like eating shrimp today.
Yeah.
I mean, it's, I think they're talking about trying to get some shrimp at the debate time even, but I don't know if that's going to happen. No pressure. Go ahead, Rob.
Could it be that the Roman Empire had better infrastructure for transporting seafood before it started to rot? I mean, I thought about that at first, but like, they always
Salt.
didn't have refrigeration.
They had lead.
But it's the new covenant.
Or you
Yeah.
could have just been
They
looking
also
ahead,
had
you gotta
aqueducts.
looking ahead to future generations and saying, look,
Yeah.
Like maybe they
in
siphoned
Yeah.
off
200,
water
2,000 years in the
and
future,
maybe
this is gonna be an
cultivated
issue.
stuff.
Yeah.
And
I feel like it's more really hammering home the fact that this wasn't a moral issue, that this wasn't something you
Yeah.
should be putting people down for.
It's just a pragmatic
It is.
health issue. That was good advice.
It's
Don't make
tertiary
yourself
from
sick.
salvation.
Yeah. Okay, also, you know, they're told, like, don't even touch reptiles. There's a huge salmonella risk. You guys might want to be careful yourself. Up to 90% of reptiles are natural carriers of salmonella. So yeah, this is pretty good advice there. Rabies, the big risk
I would wonder why we
with bats. Bats are big carriers of rabies. I was in Austin recently and seen all these signs. They're like, you know, don't touch the bats and all this. But it really is a huge danger. Most people that die of rabies get it from bats. I mean, you might think it was dogs or something, but actually it's bats. It's not exclusively bats, but it's primarily bats.
It's thought that they may also contain viruses that have coronas.
Oh,
There
no.
is that
What?
as well.
No.
2 weeks ago was International Bat Day, fun fact. We celebrated it at work.
March 20th.
So here's a note from an archaeologist that might tie into like Yavis's question. We find no classifications as logical as this in any of the other elaborate cuneiform list of fauna or ritual taboos. Some cultures sort of had taboo things, but they didn't match up with, you know, where there really was risk, you know, as well as Leviticus. Pork, obviously, Jews are famous for not eating pork, right? As most people know, you can get trichinosis, you can get various things from pork unless it's cooked at a high temperature, and that's where the problem is. They didn't always, you know, they couldn't stick in the meat thermometer and see if it's, you know, 180 or whatever. So, you know, there was risk of tapeworm. Who wants a worm growing in them, right? So let's just ban that. That's a pretty good practice, because pigs are famous for eating anything, and they get all these parasites in them. It's really bad. But today we add, you know, we add nitrites, nitrates, and cook at a high temperature, no problem.
So I see toxoplasmosis mentioned here. Maybe the reason many of us are obsessed with cats is because we eat too much pork.
Sorry, what?
You might have to explain that.
Some are certain mouse or parasites typically associated with mice that cause them to act, that cause them to not care about predators as much, particularly cats.
And toxoplasma is one of them.
So the idea is, in theory, we've got this parasite that makes us want to go near cats. The other parasite wants to make mice kill themselves, so therefore it cats.
Otherwise, people would naturally hate them.
Is that why I don't want to go to work?
Definitely 5 prerequisite courses.
All right, there's a few more references. You know, during the bubonic plague that ravaged Europe in like 14th century, well, it was multiple times, I think, but Orthodox Jews were the ones that seemed to be spared the most. They weren't totally, you know, spared from it, but because they were following the Levitical law, they had these better sanitary practices that actually helped. if all of Europe had followed that, they wouldn't have even had a bubonic plague. Because it was basically, it was spread through fleas, and the fleas would get on the rats, and it was all just bad sanitation. So that's why we don't struggle as much with things like that today. Unless you're in New York, maybe, but they have a rat czar in New York. I heard now, trying to help them fight that off.
Another issue on that is the prohibition against blood, because the old covenant said, bleed the animal out, do not eat it into blood, and cook it out.
Yeah.
Which again, blood is a major source of infection potential as well. So.
Okay, excellent point, Brendan. Yeah.
And then the English came along.
Really, all of those, what may seem strange in Leviticus, if you look at it from the lens of that ancient culture and their limitations on cooking or sanitation, it pretty much all makes sense. And then, there's a few of those restrictions about don't mix the clothing that we've already talked about that might have just had some kind of symbolic purpose to it. And it sort of demystifies it. But there are, there's some challenging passages that we want to get into next here, starting with the question of, did the Old Testament authors, were they polytheists? And they were later sort of edited out. So the claim from some, such as this article in Bart Ehrman's blog, is that, there was some kind of evolution, and Yahweh was one of the lesser gods, and the Israelites sort of elevated him to just be the main god, or eventually the only god. And they claimed that, the original authors were more polytheists, and then, someone just kind of changed it later. So, couple thoughts about this. One is, of course, the Old Testament says that most of the Israelites were polytheists. They were terrible. They kept falling into this worship of other idols and so forth. So if you find a lot of archaeological evidence of Baal worship or something, then that supports the Old Testament narrative being accurate, not defeats it. But where it is a problem, obviously, is if the authors themselves were polytheists. And I think they really don't have a very good argument from the text when it's examined in detail, even though apparently that's become a pretty popular view among a lot of Old Testament scholars who are not, believers, you could say. And yes, there are actually a number in that camp. Even Abraham, by the way, in Joshua 24, it says that, his father, and maybe the implication is that he himself used to worship many gods. But there's some sense in which God made himself known to him as the only true God. He worshiped and followed God, and now you have the three great monotheistic religions, the Abrahamic religions, as was mentioned earlier, coming out of from him. There is actually a lot of archaeological evidence for ancient monotheism, though, throughout the world, not as the only religious belief, but as one of the very earliest that existed in all parts of the world. So there's some evidence that God could have revealed himself as the one true God around to all the people, but over time they fall into polytheism and so forth, and then you need to have some kind of revival. You need an Abrahamic figure or someone else to help them see that no, there's really just one God. Don't worship the sun. Don't worship the animals. Things, just common sense things like that. There's really just two main passages from which they argue for this polytheism, which itself should tell you something. It looks a bit more like, are they twisting this? Is this quote mining? Do we really have a good case here? Psalm 82 and Deuteronomy 32 are really the main passages they try to use for making this argument. And we should point out the whole theory here is one for which we have no evidence. In other words, it's not as though you can find some old version of the Old Testament that does have some polytheism in it, clearly, and then it's like, okay, now we have a newer manuscript and they changed the words. That simply does not exist anywhere. There's no evidence of that type. These scholars are just assuming that could have been the case. They're applying this sort of preconceived idea of monotheism evolving from polytheism as sort of just their working assumption, I think. Yeah.
Maybe I'm not really understanding the argument, but how is, even if some of the early Israelites, early authors were polytheistic, how is that even a defeater for monotheism or the fact that the Bible is itself inspired? Because you can still have the human being's understanding of God changes and matures,
Yeah.
that doesn't change the nature of God himself.
Yeah, that's a good point, and I think I agree. I think, yeah, like we said about Abraham, which we don't have a direct writing from him, but if we did, it's fine that he used to believe in multiple gods. I think where it would be a problem is if they're claiming like, Leviticus used to say different things and they just sort of back edit it during the exile or some such nonsense.
Like as if
That's where it could be a problem.
in the Bible, where to like that there are multiple gods or something.
Alex?
There are further examples in the Bible of people who weren't entirely orthodox in their beliefs, still speaking the words of God, like for example Balaam in Numbers,
Yeah.
or even a case can even be made that Solomon is an example of this.
Yeah. You even see like in Isaiah, he talks about my servant Cyrus, this pagan king, God uses him for his purpose. So yeah, I mean, that's a good point as well. But obviously there's a lot of verses, I'm not going to read all these, throughout the Old Testament that show clear belief in only one God in the very earliest manuscripts we have. But they're trying to make a big deal out of something in Deuteronomy 32 where it talks about God sort of the Most High giving the nations their inheritance, and then he uses a different name for God in verse 9, the Lord, Yahweh, and they try to say, well, this is speaking of two different gods or something like that. But obviously, throughout the Bible, there's often different names for the same one God that are provided. He's Jehovah Jireh, he's a provider, they're trying to cover the aspects of God. And so I think they're putting way too much into this claim. The verse is not really even saying that Elion gave something to Yahweh, Most High gave to Yahweh. I think clearly in this, they're talking just two different names for the same God. Because if you go a little bit further in the chapter, it's very clear, the last verse here, I am he, there is no God beside me. That's the same chapter. Even if you want to say it was redacted, it's like, come on, the editors would have edited it to look monotheistic. So I don't think it's saying what they think it is. Psalm 82 is the other one where it kind of talks about, you are God's meeting in this divine council. You are sons of the Most High. But the key thing here to realize is that in Hebrew, the word translated for gods is just Elohim. This is a very generic term that could be any non-physical being. It could be applied to angels, the devil, things of that nature. It's just not a physical being like humans, is all it's saying. And the Bible does speak about, the prince of Persia, and it talks about in Ephesians 6, our battle is not against flesh and blood, but against spiritual forces of wickedness. It talks about a demonic world in the Bible of spirit beings. It's part of the explanation of the problem of evil. The world is pretty messed up because there are people out there, there are persons who I think are in the angelic realm that are like demons that are causing havoc. At least I think that there's a good case in the Bible, that's going on. Yeah.
They recently came out with a horror movie, but it's actually a Christian movie in the sky.
okay.
I don't know if you've heard of it, but it's about like a demon.
What's it called?
Nefarious.
Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, I mean, this is, once you realize that, again, like we talked about 2 weeks ago, Hebrew had just a very limited vocabulary. Some words had multiple meanings. So if you're talking about the spiritual beings that are not humans, then that you have to use Elohim. And the fact that some people translate that as gods in English can be misleading, I think. But here's Michael Heiser with his examples of usages of the word Elohim within the Old Testament. Demons, disembodied human dead, etc. Angel of Yahweh. So I think clearly this is a very broad meaning. It doesn't mean that there were other divine beings that God is dealing with of the same nature as his. I think it's very unarguable that the Old Testament presents the one true God as being a species unique, all-powerful, unlimited. These other ones are just beings, created beings. God made everything. That's the message of the Old Testament.
When Jesus quotes that psalm that says, "You are gods," in John 10, the Greek actually, he does say theoi. He says what exactly is?
Yeah, I looked at that passage some because I've always wondered about that passage. When I was reading this, I was like, "What's up with that?" It is a little weird. He was trying to avoid being killed there, I think, and he was offering them a confusing passage. It's like, look, your own texts speak about these things. Because I think there was near where he said, "I and the Father are one," right?
Yeah.
And so it's unclear. I don't have a good theory of exactly why he said that or what he meant. But I do know that word Elohim is very broad, and he already communicated. He wasn't backing down from saying that he and the Father are one, but I think he was just trying to sort of rebut their claim, like,
Or
you're doing something unscriptural.
or at least the Greek record of him saying it says theoi.
Yeah,
He would have probably been saying it in Aramaic or something.
that's a good point as well.
What's the reference on it?
It is in John 10. I don't.
So now they're gonna stone him because you and your man are claiming to be son of God, and says they called you sons.
Yeah.
Yeah, he quotes Psalm 82 there to try to keep from being killed in some sense. Not that he was being deceptive or anything, though.
I'm not sure if this would dovetail onto that, but I was
Okay.
just gonna say that, if you were to go to one of the Pharisees at that time and say, "Oh, well, your authors of the Pentateuch, they were obviously polytheistic," because, they would have stoned you.
Yeah, they would say that's ridiculous.
Yeah. Yeah, so there's at least that there's that control, even if people
Yeah.
think that the texts were manipulated.
They were much closer in time to when they were written than we are today.
Right.
To think that, they wouldn't have known, but somehow we, 2,000 years later, we know exactly what, that's a pretty far-fetched. One point Michael Heiser makes, and then I'll move on to the slavery question because we're really short on time here, but he points out that, the Essene community that produced the Dead Sea Scrolls that was living in 2nd century BC, 1st century AD in that time period, everyone admits they were very monotheistic, but they used the same kind of discussion of the divine council that you see in Psalms 82, showing that they didn't view it as this council of all these gods, little g gods, that were sort of like Yahweh in any sense, more of just whatever that refers to. It's not an attack on monotheism. So that's an interesting point. There's not even a Hebrew word for female deity, which is also an interesting point. If they were really this polytheistic culture, you think they might have a word for goddess or something like that, but they don't. And the other point I like to draw here would be that, okay, if you're bothered by the lack of archaeological evidence for monotheism, just think about the 10 Commandments. You shall have you shall not make graven images. The whole point was you don't make idols if you believe in monotheism, so that makes it harder to get the positive evidence. We have it in spades in writing, all the ancient writings, but we don't, we shouldn't expect to find idols of Yahweh. All right. And if you go to the earliest writings, we have some now that date to the 7th century BC. This famous silver amulet that was found that has the priestly blessing, talking about Yahweh already. The oldest writings in Hebrew treat Yahweh in a monotheistic way. And we find these before, some of the skeptics had these really liberal views of when these were written, and now we've started to find things that were older than when they say they were ever written. So the Bible is proving itself true over the skeptics. Yes?
Do they still omit the vows in these kind of more ancient writings that were meant to be formal for the priests and these kinds of things? Do they still omit the
I think they did, right? Until later, it was only later they added vowels, from my understanding. And then this is a really recent finding that was announced. Dr. Stripling, who is from Katy, Texas, down there near Yavuz. He's a longtime archaeologist, does a lot of digs in Israel, and was the head of a team that discovered this very ancient writing on a lead tablet, which is it's a curse tablet, and it's an early form of Hebrew, and it has inscribed on it also, something about the God Yahweh. So again, the very earliest things you ever get in Hebrew, it's talking about Yahweh. It's not talking about El. It's not talking about some evolution, some multi-gods. It's very Yahweh-centric. And so that's, I think that's good evidence for, yes, this has not been tampered with or something. This is very ancient. It dates to sort of around the time of Joshua. We've got good evidence that it's authentic and that it's from the time period, because even the chemical isotopes of the lead in the tablet are connected to a mine in Greece known to be active during that time period. So it's a very significant find because of its ancient nature. 200 years older than any other Hebrew text in existence, much older than Dead Sea Scrolls. One can no longer argue with a straight face that biblical text was not written until the Persian period or Hellenistic period. So yeah, this is really, really great. Even the curse tablet being found on Mount Ebal connects with the Bible, where this was supposedly the mountain of curse. So that's a lot of interesting tidbits. But let's talk just briefly in the last 15 minutes or so that we have about the question of slavery, because that is bothersome, right? You're reading the Bible, the English translation, you see the word slave, you immediately think of antebellum South, U.S. We have this horrible history of slavery in our own country, and obviously in many areas of the world there's been horrible abuses associated with slavery over the years. So there are some verses that mention slavery and perhaps superficially at least may seem to condone it, and then some argue that it actually, the Bible promotes it. How do we respond to those claims? What do the verses really say? We need to look at the question of whether the Bible is really promoting it, or is it recording what happened? What is it really getting at when it uses those verses translated in that way? But as background, I think first it's important to realize that what the Bible clearly promotes throughout is a revolutionary level of equality, unparalleled by any ancient text. I think this is simply indisputable by anybody that really knows history. There's many famous, well, Tom Holland, not the Superman actor, but a famous historian. He's not a Christian, but he's just blown away by the degree to which Christ changed the nature of equality of all people. He used to be just in love with the classics. He's a classical scholar, an expert, and he finally says he came to realize that, that culture was just terrible. These people were, abusing women, and they had all these slaves. Even Plato and Socrates advocated slavery. But he said Jesus was the revolutionary one that changed the mindset that he has today. And so he finally realized he needs to have more respect for this Jesus tradition. But within the Bible, you find some radical claims, like in Galatians. This would have been really radical for the time. There's neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free man. There's neither male nor female. You're all one in Christ. Everyone had the same status. You're made in the image of God in Genesis 1, male and female. And there's a dignity and honor just from being a human. It doesn't matter what class you're from, what ethnicity, anything like that. And they were told to actually kiss one another. You would have people being told to kiss servants or slaves. Many of the ancient church were actually slaves. And it is true that the slavery practiced by the Greco-Roman world was certainly horrible. It was a lot different than what the Hebrew Bible talks about, which we'll get into in a minute, which is more of an indentured servanthood kind of model. But Jesus came to proclaim release to the captives, set free those who are oppressed, very anti-slavery. We have a whole book of the Bible written to free a slave, Onesimus, who was a runaway, and Paul was trying to convince Philemon to release him. By contrast, Islam has their founder, Muhammad, buying, selling, capturing, and owning slaves. And this was slavery of the kind that was somewhat similar to the American South. So Bible-believing Christians have actually led the battle to eliminate slavery And as Rodney Stark points out, that basically all classical societies were slave societies. Amid this universal slavery, only one civilization ever rejected human bondage, Christendom, and it did it twice. I mean, unfortunately, they had to do it again, but yeah. So in the 9th century, there's this bishop saying, you know, all men are brothers, all invoke the one same Father God, the slave and the master, the poor and the rich man. There is no slave or free, but in all things and always there is only one Christ. Soon no one doubted that slavery in itself was against the divine law. So his reading of the Bible showed him clearly that slavery was wrong. Why is it that some people don't draw that conclusion? A lot of it, I think, is the fallen human nature. There were slave owners who wanted to read the Bible and find some way to make it okay for them to have slaves because it brought them great wealth. But it's true that it's not every abolitionist was a Christian, but the vast majority were. You can definitely say that the leading movement arose out of Christians who were Bible believers. Abraham Lincoln, Harry Beecher Stowe, William Wilberforce from the UK won the battle against slavery in the 19th century. So Beecher Stowe wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin. She was from a very religious family full of pastors, and this book was very influential. If you haven't seen the movie Amazing Grace about Wilberforce and how he got rid of the slave trade in the UK, highly recommended. So again, you have atheists, experts, scholars saying things like this. This is Luc Ferry, prominent French philosopher. The Greek world was fundamentally an aristocratic world, the universe organized as a hierarchy in which those most endowed by nature should in principle be at the top, with the less endowed saw themselves occupying inferior ranks. And we should not forget that the Greek city-state was founded on slavery. So they had a huge problem. And he said, you know, they had this belief of a natural hierarchy of plants, of animals, and also of men. Some men are born to command, others to obey, which is why Greek political life accommodates itself easily to the notion of slavery. In direct contradiction, Christianity was introduced the notion that humanity was fundamentally identical, that men were equal in dignity, an unprecedented idea at the time, and one to which our whole world owes its entire democratic inheritance. And it turned an entire world order upside down. So again, this is coming not from some Bible believer, but just from an atheist scholar, very prominent one. And he's not by any means the only one. It's really anybody that's really studied that in an honest way has to admit these kind of things. He's very much a secular humanist, but at least he recognizes the roots of that. And he struggles with, like, how do we keep secular humanism going if people don't believe in these principles? So that it is a challenge, right? How do you ground morality without God? He says the idea of equal dignity of all human beings makes its first appearance in Christianity, was to become the precursor of the modern democracy. But obviously there's still a problem if even just one part of the Bible is promoting slavery. All right. Again, not everything the Bible describes is promoting. You might sometimes need to regulate a problematic behavior, just like a government has rules against, you know, being drunk and disorderly or driving while intoxicated. They don't have a rule about being drunk in your house or something like that. So yeah, sometimes the Bible has to talk about things that are not ideal. Even Jesus said that Moses allowed them to divorce their wives, but he said it was not that way from the beginning. God does hate divorce. It's not something that he wants ideally, but in some cases, you know, there were provisions in the case of adultery, things like that. But yeah, he says that Moses had to, you know, this wasn't not an ideal law that you find in Leviticus. So that itself should kind of clue you in, like, not every law there was ideal. It might have been an accommodation to the immoral nature of people at the time. Other examples, the Bible definitely promotes monogamy, being married to one person, not many. But you have many examples of polygamy. But you can almost read it, you see the bad things that happens because David has many wives, it causes all these problems. You could read it as a narrative as making a very powerful case for with the advantages of being married to only one person. And yet, and it does condemn it, but it doesn't do it every verse, right? Because you need to take the Bible as a whole and not just, take bits and pieces and try to interpret it. But let's talk more about slavery in the Bible. Go ahead, Grant.
Just on the last thing, you were saying some of these laws maybe like the divorce one, like it wasn't ideal. But could you argue that because he lets divorce be not ideal and he just kind of leaves it there for that time, he's more concerned with people not eating shrimp than divorce, because shrimp, not eating shrimp maybe is also a countercultural law, but yet he enforces that one, and divorce is just kind of, he leaves it.
The point was people were getting divorced, and Moses is like, well, if you're going to get a divorce, you better give them a certificate. There was ways in which it could protect, if they were going to get a divorce anyway, that was really hard on the woman in that culture, and you needed some kind of certificate to show your status, I think. I don't know all the details, but I've heard some scholars talking about it. And so this was a way of helping the one that was damaged by the divorce to be able to, sort of make their way in this tough situation. I mean, the shrimp thing, you could argue, is just I'm going to try to keep people alive. They can't be trusted to discern if it has bacteria or not, or cook it right. So we're just going to set up this law. But it was a temporary thing because eventually we have the technology and there's no reason to not eat it at this point, kind of thing. But yeah, we can talk more at the end if you want about any of that. But let's talk just briefly about, okay, the first thing you want to think about is that the word slave is actually not in the Bible. Now, there is a word translated as slave, but if you go back to the King James Version, there was only one word in the whole thing that said the word slave. Okay? The real word is ebed.
Are you talking about the Old Testament specifically, or the whole thing?
Yeah, probably more of the Old Testament.
Because
I think in Greek, you could argue that, for example, Philemon, Onesimus, he was a slave in the very sense, the bad sense of the word slave, for example. And when it says there is no slave or free man, I think the word there does mean. The point is more that in the Old Testament, when it's talking about what is translated as slavery, it's really the word ebed, which is very different than what you think of when you hear the word slave in English. It's basically more similar to an indentured servitude, such as if you came over on the Mayflower, you signed a contract often. If you didn't have enough money to pay for the boat ride over, but you wanted to offer a better life, you would say, okay, I'll go over, I'll work for N number of years, and if you can just give me passage over there. You're an indentured servant. You're not abused, it's not like the American South was with all the terrible things. It's just more of an agreement you make. It's contract labor for a time. And that's very similar to what it was for the Hebrews that is mentioned in Leviticus, in the Levitical law, when it says ebed.
So do we know, did the Hebrew language have a word for the bad slave, the bad type of slave? Did they even have one?
I'm not sure. My guess is because they had so few words, they might have used this word in that context too.
Yeah, so I guess how would you know then if it's,
slavery in Egypt
context.
Mm-hmm. Did they use this word for slavery in Egypt?
It's a good question. My guess is they might have, because you have such limited words.
Okay.
The key point though is that when it's talking about an ebed as a servant and saying every year of Jubilee, which is every 7th year, you have to free everyone. And that, there's a bunch of regulations to try to keep slaves from being abused. If you get in a fight with your slave and you knock their tooth out, you have to free them. There's a bunch of rules like that you find. One scholar says Hebrew has no vocabulary of slavery, only of servanthood.
I think there's also a distinction between, slaves, ebed, within Israel versus the slaves that they take from other cultures. Because I think there's even a spot where he talks about when you encounter these other cultures, they have slaves, and there's a different way that you have to handle that.
Yeah, I think it's all about context. But yeah, it'd be interesting to look up. I'm not totally sure if they have another Hebrew word. My guess is they may not. But I think what this scholar is saying, that the kind of servanthood that's sort of advocated or regulated or allowed explicitly is just an aspect of servanthood, which would be very different than what you have in the American South. You have people, we have archaeology that talks about people being proud to be an Ebed, for example, of King Jeroboam. Let's look at more on the definition. One scholar says it's a dynamic relational term. The person marked with this root is characterized as dependent on a relational partner. The focus is on a relationship. It's not a class. It's not a caste system. It's not something like that. It's not inherently negative. I mean, you could be in a negative situation as an Ebed, but there's nothing inherent in it. And what is being regulated in the Old Testament is not something at all remotely similar to slavery as we would think of it when we hear that term.
Chattel slavery.
Exactly.
I've,
Go ahead real quick, and then I want to get to this before we run out of time.
so to your point, I was actually, I just looked through actually, I was actually looking through the Septuagint again.
Okay.
And the word doulos, which is how the bad slavery, like the chattel slavery was referred to, actually doesn't appear in the Old Testament words that are often translated as slave.
Okay, that goes along with what I'm saying. So,
Yeah.
So here's something put together by Dr. Peter J. Williams, really top scholar at Tyndale House, Cambridge. And so he points out, look, this is very different. What you see in the Old Testament, they had holidays. Okay, some New World slaves did, but that's about all. Every other of these was very negative in the American South. They lacked food, legal redress, sexual protection. They were kidnapped. There was issues with chains, torture, and physical abuse. You have none of those negatives, and you have the positive protections in the Levitical law toward those ebeds, those indentured servants. And Roman slavery was arguably even worse than what was in the American South. They didn't even give them holidays. So really horrible. So one way to look at it, for example, is often people will mention like, oh, the Old Testament, they just borrowed some stuff from the Code of Hammurabi, something like that. Well, no, actually, it's quite different. In the Code of Hammurabi, you're allowed, and actually, you would get in big trouble if you didn't return a runaway slave to their master. In fact, you could be killed. By contrast, in the Old Testament, it says if you get a runaway slave, and this includes foreign slaves, by the way, you shall not give him up to his master. A slave who has escaped from his master to you, he shall dwell with you in your midst, in the place that he shall choose within one of your towns, wherever it suits him. You shall not wrong him. So that's quite a contrast, right? No other ancient Eastern law has been found that holds a master to account for the treatment of his own slaves, as distinct from injury done to the slave of another master. Yeah, you get in a lot of trouble if you hurt someone else's slave, but not your own. But in the Old Testament, you could actually get killed for killing your slave, as a matter of fact. Just since we're out of time, I'm skipping a little bit here, but okay, so think about how slavery arose and persisted in the South. Slaves were kidnapped against their will. That's capital punishment in the Old Testament. So you're going to end that right there. If you kidnap anybody, you're put to death. So it wouldn't have gotten off the ground. Also, you're freeing everyone every 7 years at the most. So you, in the Old Testament, you decide whether or not you want to be a servant. It's a voluntary thing. You decide if you want to have this agreement. If you're really poor, think about how poor this culture is. We see people homeless, will work for food, things like that. If one of you guys took in a homeless and you actually gave them a place to live and fed them and put them to work some, that would be kind of similar to this indentured servanthood thing. Now, they're free at any time to run away and be protected, right? They're not entirely, even if they signed an agreement, they could flee and be okay. So it's very different from what was happening in the American South, as you can see. There were provisions in the laws of Israel, sort of anti-harm laws, anti-return laws. So it's very different than chattel slavery And in fact, there was many provisions in the Old Testament to try to keep people from becoming poor enough to have to be in this situation in which they would fall into slavery to begin with. You were to give them interest-free loans. You were not to harvest all of your property, but on the edges, you were to leave some wheat or fruit or whatever for them to just take for free. As you're walking down the road, the part near the road was supposed to have stuff for the poor. So there's a lot of provisions in the Old Testament where it's trying to watch out for them. But, if you think about it, when there's drought, when there's these really bad hardships, if someone was irresponsible and got into a lot of debt, how do you make that right? If someone wronged you and hurt how do they repay you if they have no money and they stole your ox or something? I don't know. There were ways of, okay, here's a way where you can pay things back, you can be responsible, but you were not to ever abuse the slaves or ebeds, if you will, and that kind of thing. But we're out of time at this point. But we can talk more if anybody wants to afterwards. And thank you guys for coming.
Thank you.
We'll talk to you later. So again, tonight, where's the
Dairy Queen.
I don't know, what do y'all want?
Dairy Queen.
You're saying Dairy Queen now?
Yes.
10
o'clock.
They do close at 10.
They have food. Surprisingly.
Okay.
Annabelle?
Sure, we can do Dairy Queen. I'll bring extra good milkshakes next week.
Competition, huh?
And then you'll just get them from Dairy Queen.
Oh, yeah.
I am going to give the address. and
Oh, yeah,
the
everybody
address.
download the Texas Dairy Queen app, and that's where you get the coupons. Not the regular Dairy Queen app.
Huh?
Well, we had an argument where I was like, we should go to Dairy Queen, and he was like, no. And I was like, well, we can go somewhere else.
Now y'all are like the opposite. That's
So,
why
and
I'm
I feel
feeling
bad.